The air in the dining room didn't just feel cold, it felt sharp, as if the very oxygen had been replaced by microscopic shards of glass. Choi Do-yoon sat perfectly still, his spine a rigid line of steel against the high-backed chair. His hands rested on the mahogany surface, fingers inches away from the two objects that would decide the trajectory of his soul. To his left lay the divorce decree, a crisp, white stack of paper that promised the continuation of a bloodline and the survival of an empire. To his right sat the 9mm handgun, a heavy, matte black weight that offered a different, more permanent kind of silence. Madame Choi watched him with the unblinking focus of a predator. Her cream hanbok seemed to glow in the dim light of the chandelier, a symbol of the centuries of tradition she carried on her frail shoulders. A man is defined by what he is willing to discard, Do-yoon, she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a razor. The girl is a beautiful distraction, but the Choi name is eternal. Sign the papers, and we forget this lapse in judgment. Reach for the gun, and you prove you are no longer fit to lead. Across the table, Efua sat in a gown of emerald and gold, her Kente fabric a vibrant defiance against the sterile grays and blacks of the Choi mansion. She didn't look at the gun. She didn't look at the paper. She looked directly at Do-yoon. Her expression wasn't one of fear or pleading, it was a quiet challenge, a reminder of the man he had become in the sun-drenched streets of Accra. Her composure was a fortress of its own, she wasn't waiting to be saved, she was waiting to see if the man she loved was still there behind the Ice King mask. Do-yoon felt the sweat bead at his hairline, a rare crack in his disciplined veneer. He was trapped between two fires. If he signed, he would lose the only light he had ever found in the dark. If he reached for the weapon, he would have to become the very monster his mother had spent decades grooming him to be. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked with the rhythmic finality of a heart monitor. The silence stretched until it was unbearable, a physical pressure pushing him toward a decision that would either cement his legacy in blood or burn it to the ground for the sake of peace. He slowly began to move his hand, his eyes shifting from the sterile white of the document to the cold, dark metal of the barrel. Seoul was a city of glass and ghosts, and Choi Do-yoon was the engine that kept both moving. From his obsidian-topped desk on the penthouse floor of the Choi Tower, he didn't just overlook the Han River, he owned the currents beneath it. To the public, he was the visionary CEO of a shipping conglomerate, but to the underworld, he was the Ice King, a man whose ruthless efficiency had turned the Choi Syndicate from a regional power into a global shadow. He operated with surgical precision, treating every betrayal like a faulty line of code that needed to be deleted. The shipment was intercepted because you were careless, Director Kong, Do-yoon said, his voice as flat and cold as a winter morning. He didn't look up from the tablet he was reviewing. He didn't need to. The man standing across from him was vibrating with a terror that filled the sterile room. Carelessness is a luxury the Choi family cannot afford. You have 1 hour to settle your affairs. There was no shouting, no flamboyant displays of violence. That was for the street gangs. Do-yoon's power was absolute because it was quiet. With a single flick of his wrist, the security detail led the weeping man away, and Do-yoon returned to his spreadsheets. To the world, he was a dragon, fierce and untouchable. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the armor of the Ice King began to feel like a shroud. The transition from the corporate tower to the ancestral Choi estate was a journey through time and psychological weight. As his black sedan passed through the massive iron gates, the neon hum of the city was replaced by the suffocating silence of tradition. Here, the glass gave way to ancient cedar and stone, and the CEO became a son. Madame Choi was waiting in the inner garden, her silhouette framed by the twisted branches of a centuries-old pine. She was pruning a bonsai tree with the same methodical focus her son used to prune his organization. She didn't turn when he approached. She didn't have to, she had raised him to move with a specific cadence, a rhythm of duty she could identify in her sleep. You were 5 minutes late, Do-yoon, she said, the snip of her shears punctuating the sentence. A dragon who loses track of time eventually loses his fire. The director Kong matter required my personal attention, mother, he replied, his posture shifting into a rigid, formal bow. She finally turned, her pale face a mask of elegant severity. She reached out, her fingers, cold and dry like parchment, adjusting the lapel of his suit. It was a gesture of affection that felt like a collar being tightened. You are the face of our ancestors. Never forget that your life is not your own. It belongs to the name. Every breath you take must serve the bloodline. Under her gaze, the man who held the city's heart in his hand felt like a bird in a gilded cage. He was the dragon of Seoul, but he lived forever in his mother's shadow. The flight from Seoul to Accra was a 12,000-kilometer bridge between two worlds that should never have touched. For Choi Do-yoon, the journey was a sterile transition, a period of forced stillness in the first-class cabin where the only sound was the low hum of the engines and the rhythmic clicking of his keyboard. He didn't look out the window as the plane crossed continents. He didn't care for the view. To him, the world was merely a series of nodes and supply lines, and Ghana was the latest node that needed to be secured. His mother's voice echoed in his mind with more clarity than the flight attendant's announcements. Gold is the blood of the earth, Do-yoon. Secure the routes, and we no longer have to rely on the volatility of the digital markets. Bring the dragon's fire to the coast. She had handed him the assignment with the same cold detachment she used to prune her bonsai. It was a necessity, expansion of the Choi footprint into the raw minerals of West Africa. He expected a boring mission of bribing port officials and intimidating local miners. He expected to be back in the glass towers of Seoul within a fortnight, his suit still pressed and his soul still encased in ice. When the cabin door opened at Kotoka International Airport, the heat hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the thickness of the air, heavy with the scent of jet fuel, sea salt and something vibrant and untamed that he couldn't quite name. As he stepped onto the tarmac, his tailored black suit, a masterpiece of Italian wool, felt like a straitjacket. His security detail, for men in matching monochrome, fanned out around him, their eyes scanning the horizon for threats that weren't there. They looked like an oil slick on a bright blue sea. The drive through the city of Accra was a sensory assault. Unlike the orderly, neon-lit corridors of Seoul where everything moved in a predictable grid, Accra was a riot of motion. Market women balanced impossible towers of goods on their heads, their cloths a kaleidoscope of wax prints that made Do-yoon's vision swim. The air was a cacophony of high-life music, honking horns, and the rhythmic shouting of street vendors. It was chaotic, loud, and pulse-quickening. To Do-yoon, it was a mess that needed to be organized. The local contact is waiting at the safe house in Jamestown, his lead security officer said, checking a secure tablet. He says the gold smugglers are nervous. There's a new influence in the district, someone the people actually trust. It's slowing down the negotiations. Do-yoon adjusted his silk tie, his expression unchanging despite the sweat beginning to prickle at his collar. Nervousness is just a lack of incentive, he replied, his baritone voice cutting through the humid air. We will provide the incentive. If they won't move for money, they will move for fear. It's a universal language. He watched the city blur past the tinted windows, the red dust of the roadside, the leaning palms, the smiles of children who didn't know they were being watched by a predator. He felt a strange, nagging discomfort in his chest, a sensation he dismissed as the flight's lingering turbulence. He was the Ice King, the dragon's shadow, and he had a job to do. He had no way of knowing that the influence his men spoke of, the force slowing down his smuggling routes, wasn't a rival gang or a corrupt politician. It was a woman who was about to show him that some things in this world are more valuable than gold, and some fires cannot be put out by ice. The following morning, the heat in Accra had already reached a shimmering intensity that turned the horizon into a liquid blur. Choi Do-yoon moved through the narrow, crowded arteries of the Makola market, a dark shark in a sea of vibrant coral. His security detail was a wall of black suits and unyielding shoulders, carving a path through the dense throng of vendors and shoppers with a callousness that made the air around them turn cold. Do-yoon didn't look at the faces of the people he passed. To him, they were obstacles, friction in a machine designed for efficiency. He was here to meet a middleman who promised access to the artisanal mines in the Ashanti region, and he wanted the meeting over before the midday sun could ruin the crease in his trousers. The market was a cacophony of life, the sharp, earthy scent of dried ginger and cloves, the rhythmic pounding of fufu in the distance, and the relentless bargaining that rose like a tide. His lead guard, a man named Min-ho, shoved aside a stack of woven baskets to clear the way, his expression one of bored contempt. When an elderly woman carrying a tray of oranges stumbled from the force of his push, Min-ho didn't even look back. He simply kept moving, his hand hovering near the holster concealed by his jacket. Stop. The word wasn't screamed, but it carried a resonance that sliced through the market's din. The guards halted, more out of surprise than obedience. Do-yoon stopped as well, his eyes narrowing as he looked past Min-ho's broad back. Standing in the center of the dusty path was a woman who seemed to have captured the sun itself. She wore a dress of Kente fabric so intricate and bright, emerald greens, fiery reds, and sun-drenched yellows, that it made the surrounding colors look faded. Her hair was styled in neat, elegant braided cornrows that pulled back to reveal a face of striking, symmetrical beauty and eyes that burned with a fire Do-yoon hadn't seen in years. She was kneeling beside the fallen orange seller, helping the older woman gather her scattered fruit, but her gaze was locked onto Min-ho. "In this city, we respect our elders," she said, her voice a rich, steady baritone that commanded the space around her. She stood up slowly, her stature regal and grounded. She didn't look at the guns or the menacing postures of the men in suits. She looked at the man who had caused the offense. "Apologize to her." Min-ho laughed, a dry, mocking sound. "Move aside, girl. You have no idea who you are talking to." He stepped forward, intending to brush her out of the way, but she didn't flinch. She stepped into his space, her chin tilted up, her presence so formidable that the guard actually hesitated. Do-yoon felt a strange, electric jolt in his chest. In Seoul, people didn't stand up to the Choi Syndicate, they disappeared if they tried. He had spent his life surrounded by people who bowed until their foreheads touched the floor, people whose fear was the only thing that made them loyal. But this woman stood there with nothing but her dignity as a shield, and she was winning. "Min-ho, stand down," Do-yoon commanded, stepping through the line of his guards. He walked until he was standing a few feet from her. Up close, the scent of her was different from the market. It was the smell of shea butter and something floral, like jasmine blooming in the dark. He looked at the elderly woman, then at the scattered oranges, and finally at the woman in the Kente dress. For the first time in his life, the Ice King felt the weight of his own shadow. "My associate was clumsy," Do-yoon said, his Korean accent thick but his English precise. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a roll of high-denomination bills, offering them to the orange seller. It was more money than the woman likely made in a month. The younger woman looked at the money, then back at Do-yoon. She didn't look impressed by the wealth. She looked at him as if she were reading the very ledger of his soul. "Money can fix the fruit," she said softly, her eyes never leaving his. "But it doesn't fix the heart that thinks it is allowed to push." She turned back to the elderly woman, finishing the task of clearing the path, and then she walked away without a second glance. Do-yoon stood frozen in the middle of the dusty market, the heat of the sun finally reaching him. He watched the gold and green of her dress disappear into the crowd, feeling a sudden, desperate need to know her name. He had come to Ghana to secure gold routes, but in that single, defiant moment, he realized he had found something far more precious, and infinitely more dangerous. The dragon had found his queen, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to conquer or be conquered. For the first time in his life, Choi Do-yoon discovered that his vast intelligence network was useless when it came to tracking a soul. He could find a hidden bank account in the Cayman Islands in minutes, but finding the woman from the market felt like trying to catch the wind. He spent 3 days driving through the sweltering streets of Accra, his black sedan an unwelcome shadow in the vibrant neighborhoods of OSU and Jamestown. He didn't tell his guards why they were circling the same blocks, he simply stared out the window, his mind replaying the way the light had caught the gold in her braids. He finally found her in a small, open-air courtyard near the Jamestown lighthouse, where the salt spray of the Atlantic blurred the air. She wasn't wearing the emerald and gold of a queen, she was dressed in simple linen, surrounded by a dozen children, her voice rising in a rhythmic song as she taught them to read. The Ice King stood at the edge of the courtyard, his presence a jarring intrusion of iron and silk. When Efua looked up and saw him, she didn't stop her lesson. She simply nodded toward a wooden stool in the shade and continued. Do-yoon sat. He sat for 2 hours, watching the way she moved with a freedom he had never known. In Seoul, every movement he made was a calculation, a performance of power intended to intimidate or command. Efua moved as if she were part of the earth itself, unburdened by the need to prove anything to anyone. When the children finally dispersed, she walked over to him, wiping chalk dust from her hands. "You are a very persistent man, Mr. Choi," she said, her voice holding a touch of the wit that had fascinated him at the market. "Most men with your accessories don't have the patience for a classroom." "I am not most men," Do-yoon replied, standing to face her. He had left his guards at the end of the street, a vulnerability that made his pulse race in a way no assassination attempt ever had. "And you are not that influence my men warned me about. You are something else entirely." "I am a woman who knows her name," she countered, walking toward the sea wall. "And I think you are a man who has forgotten his." Over the weeks that followed, the gold smuggling routes became an afterthought. Do-yoon found himself drawn to Efua's world like a man dying of thirst. He traded the sterile boardrooms for the chaotic beauty of night markets, where they ate spicy kelaweel under the glow of oil lamps. He traded his silence for her stories of the Ashanti kings and the resilience of her people. One evening, as the sun began to sink into the Gulf of Guinea, painting the sky in a bruised palette of indigo and orange, they sat on a quiet stretch of beach near Labadi. For the first time, Do-yoon spoke about Seoul, not the numbers or the power, but the weight of it. He spoke of the iron throne his mother had built for him and the cold, gray vacuum of his life. "In my world, power is everything," he whispered, his fingers tracing a pattern in the red sand. "If you have power, you are safe. If you have power, you are respected." Efua looked at him, her eyes reflecting the dying light. She reached out and took his hand, her skin warm and grounding against his. "Power is a cage, Do-yoon. It tells you that you are the master of the world, but it makes you a slave to your own fear. You spend your life guarding a door that no one truly wants to enter." She squeezed his hand, her gaze piercing through the Ice King mask he had worn since childhood. "Power is useless if you have no peace. Peace is knowing that if you lost it all tomorrow, the money, the title, the tower, you would still be whole. Can you say that?" Do-yoon looked at their joined hands, the contrast of his pale, scarred skin against her deep, vibrant warmth. In the distance, he could see the lights of the shipping vessels he was supposed to be controlling, symbols of the empire his mother expected him to expand. But in that moment, the roar of the ocean was louder than his mother's voice. He realized that for 38 years, he had been a billionaire who owned nothing of value. "I have never had peace," he admitted, the words feeling like a confession. "Then let me teach you," she whispered. As she leaned in to kiss him, the cold walls around Do-yoon's heart didn't just crack, they dissolved into the salt air. He wasn't the dragon of Seoul in that moment. He was just a man, finally breathing for the first time in a world that had suddenly turned from gray to gold. He knew then that he could never go back to being a shadow. He had found the language of the heart, and it was a language his mother could never speak. The wedding did not take place in a cathedral of stone, nor was it witnessed by the high-ranking board members of the Choi Syndicate. There were no flashing cameras, no strategic alliances being toasted with vintage champagne, and no heavy security detail standing at the perimeter. Instead, under the ancient, sprawling canopy of a baobab tree in the hills of Aburi, Choi Do-yoon finally stripped away the armor of the Ice King. The air was cool and mist-laden, smelling of damp earth and the sweet, heavy scent of wild orchids. It was a cathedral of living wood and whispering leaves, a place where the neon ghosts of Seoul could not follow. Do-yoon stood waiting, his usual black suit replaced by a white linen shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. For the first time in his life, his hands were empty of a phone, a tablet, or a weapon. He felt light, almost dangerously so, as if the lack of his mother's watchful eye had untethered him from the earth. When Efua appeared, walking through the dappled sunlight, the breath he had been holding for 38 years finally escaped him. She was a vision of royal defiance. Her wedding Kente was a masterpiece of weaver's art, dominated by shimmering gold threads, symbolizing royalty and prosperity, and deep, soulful maroons. The fabric was draped over her shoulder in the traditional style, leaving her skin to glow like polished bronze against the intricate patterns. Around her neck sat a heavy gold sankofa pendant, the bird looking backward while moving forward. She wasn't just a bride, she was an entire history, a culture that refused to be silenced by the cold world he inhabited. The ceremony was presided over by a local elder, a man whose face was a map of stories. There was no legal document to sign, no contract to be notarized. This was a covenant of the spirit. In my world, Do-yoon began, his voice shaking with a vulnerability that would have horrified his mother, we are taught that blood is a debt. We owe our lives to the ancestors who came before us, and we pay that debt by carrying their shadows. But today, I am choosing a different blood. I am choosing the life I found in you. He reached out, taking her hands. I have no throne to offer you that isn't built on secrets. I have no crown that isn't heavy with ice. But I give you the man I became when I met you in the dust of the market. Efua smiled, her eyes brimming with a fierce, protective love. She took a strip of Kente cloth and began to wrap it around their joined hands, binding them together in a physical manifestation of their vow. The ocean is vast, Do-yoon, she whispered, her voice a warm anchor in the shifting mist. It is deep, and it is wide, and it is the distance your mother will try to put between us. But the ocean is also what connects us. It carries the salt of our tears and the strength of our currents. She tightened the cloth, the Kente vow, pressing their palms together. I don't need your throne. I don't need your name. I need the peace we found on the sand at Labadi. Promise me that no matter how loud the dragon roars in Seoul, you will listen for the song of the sea. Promise me that no matter the ocean between us, we are one. I promise, Do-yoon replied, the words feeling like a physical seal on his heart. No matter the ocean. No matter the blood. We are one. As the elder poured libations to the earth, calling upon the spirits to witness their union, Do-yoon felt a profound shift in the atmosphere. He was no longer a man running away from his destiny, he was a man running toward his soul. He knew that by tying this knot, he was effectively declaring war on the Choi legacy. He was committing the ultimate treason against his mother. As they walked back toward the small village, the sun began to break through the Aburi mist, casting long, golden shadows across the red earth. They were married in the eyes of the land and the sky, bound by a vow that was stronger than silk and more enduring than gold. For one brief, shimmering afternoon, the Ice King was just a husband, and the Golden Queen was his home. But as the distant sound of a ringing satellite phone pierced the silence of the garden, Do-yoon's hand tightened on Efua's. The world of shadows was calling him back, and he knew that the hardest part of their vow wouldn't be making it would be keeping it alive in the cold. The flight back to Seoul had felt like a descent into a cold, dark ocean. When the wheels of the private jet touched the rain-slicked tarmac of Incheon, the vibrant heat of Accra was officially a ghost, a memory tucked away in the breast pocket of Choi Do-yoon's coat. He had stepped off the plane not as a husband, but as the Ice King, his face a mask of granite that even the biting Korean wind could not crack. Behind him, hidden by the tinted glass of a separate SUV, Efua sat in a silence that was heavy with the weight of her new reality. The apartment Do-yoon had chosen was a masterpiece of architectural isolation. Located in a high-rise in a quiet, ultra-exclusive pocket of Hanam-dong, it was a sanctuary built of glass, steel, and secrets. It was a space designed for a man who didn't want to be found, even by his own ghosts. Inside, the walls were minimalist white, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Seoul Tower, which pierced the night sky like a glowing needle. It was luxurious, it was modern, and to Efua, it felt like a gilded cage. "It is only for a while, Efua," Do-yoon whispered that first night, his voice echoing in the sterile living room. He had already put his suit jacket back on, the armor he needed to wear the moment he stepped outside that door. "Until I can secure the board. Until I can make her understand." Efua stood by the window, her reflection ghosting over the neon veins of the city. She was wrapped in a shawl of deep indigo, a piece of home she refused to let go of. "You speak of your mother as if she is a storm we can wait out," she said softly, turning to look at him. "But storms pass, Do-yoon. Your mother is the sky itself. She is everywhere." Their life became a dangerous, rhythmic deception. By day, Do-yoon was the ruthless sovereign of the Choi Tower. He moved through the world of the syndicate with a lethality that was sharper than before, driven by the desperate need to finish his work so he could return to the only place he felt alive. He authorized the seizure of rival warehouses, he navigated the treacherous waters of corporate espionage, and he sat across from his mother in silence, his heart a drum of hidden truths. Madame Choi would watch him over her tea, her eyes searching for the scent of the outsider she had sensed months ago, but Do-yoon had become a master of the shadow. But the moment the sun dipped below the horizon, the dragon would shed his skin. He would dismiss his guards at the perimeter of the building, men he had handpicked for their lack of curiosity, and ascend to the penthouse. When the door clicked shut, the Ice King melted. Inside the apartment, the world changed. Efua had slowly, stubbornly, begun to colonize the sterile space. She had filled the glass vases with tropical blooms that struggled against the Seoul climate, and the scent of ginger, garlic, and Scotch bonnet peppers would often drift through the vents, a defiant olfactory rebellion against the scentless luxury of the building. They lived in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. They would sit on the floor, the Kente cloth from their wedding spread out like a sacred map, and talk of a future that felt as fragile as spun glass. "I saw a bird today," Efua told him one evening as he rested his head in her lap, his eyes closed to block out the memory of a particularly bloody board meeting. "A magpie. It sat on the balcony and looked at me. I think it knew I didn't belong here." Do-yoon took her hand, his thumb tracing the gold bracelet she always wore. "You belong with me. That is the only geography that matters." "Is it?" she asked, her voice tinged with a sadness that cut through him. "You are living two lives, Do-yoon. One in the light where you are a monster, and one in the dark where you are a man. Eventually, the monster will want to come home, or the man will be forced into the light. What happens then?" The tension of their double life began to manifest in the small things, the way Do-yoon flinched at the sound of an unexpected notification on his phone, the way Efua stopped singing when she heard the elevator hum. Every time he left the apartment, he felt like he was leaving his soul behind in a room that didn't exist on any official record. Every time he returned, he checked the seals on the door with a frantic, obsessive precision. The danger wasn't just in the syndicate's rivals, it was in the silence of the Choi estate. Madame Choi's patience was not a lack of action, it was a gathering storm. She had begun to ask questions about the unaccounted hours in his schedule, her voice like a silk cord tightening around his neck. One night, as a blizzard began to blanket Seoul in a suffocating white, Do-yoon stood at the window of the hidden apartment, watching the snow erase the city. He felt the weight of the blood and Kent vow pressing against his chest. He was keeping her safe, but he was keeping her invisible. He had brought his queen to a land of shadows, and he realized with a sickening jolt that in his effort to protect her, he had made her a prisoner of his own fear. As the wind howled against the glass, he knew the double life was reaching its breaking point. The Ice King couldn't keep the fire hidden forever, eventually, the heat would crack the glass. The secret apartment in Hanam-dong had always been quiet, but on this afternoon, the silence felt brittle, like thin ice stretched over a dark, rushing river. Outside, the Seoul winter was relentless, a gray-white shroud that had turned the Han River into a jagged spine of frost. Inside, Efua was trying to brew a pot of ginger tea, the steam rising in fragrant clouds that fought against the sterile, scentless air of the penthouse. She was humming a song from her childhood, a song about the golden sun of the Ashanti, when the heavy, reinforced door of the apartment clicked open. She froze. Do-yoon wasn't expected back for hours. He never entered without a specific cadence to his knock, a signal of safety. The woman who stepped into the living room was not her husband. She was a silhouette of ivory and shadow, her presence so cold it seemed to suck the heat right out of the room. Madame Choi Hyrin walked with a slow, deliberate grace, her silk hanbok whispering against the hardwood floor. Behind her stood two guards, their faces as expressionless as the stone statues at the estate gates. Madame Choi did not look around with curiosity. She looked at the apartment with the clinical disgust of a doctor examining a tumor. Her eyes finally landed on Efua, who stood by the kitchen island, her hands still damp from the tea leaves. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The vibrant green and gold of Efua's shawl was a loud, defiant scream against the monochrome elegance of the matriarch. "It is a beautiful cage my son has built for you," Madame Choi said, her voice a low, melodic chill that made the hair on Efua's arms stand up. She didn't wait to be invited. She sat at the minimalist dining table, her posture perfectly vertical, her hands folding neatly in her lap. But cages are meant to keep things in, not to keep the world out. There is nowhere in this city where the Choi shadow does not reach. Efua felt a surge of fear, but she forced herself to breathe, to find the groundedness Do-yoon so admired. She poured the ginger tea into 2 ceramic cups and walked to the table, placing one in front of the older woman. "In my country, we welcome guests with what we have," Efua said, her voice steady despite the thudding of her heart. "Do-yoon told me you were a woman who valued tradition. I hope you value honesty as well." Madame Choi looked at the cup of tea, then back at Efua. She didn't touch the drink. Instead, she reached into the sleeve of her hanbok and pulled out a small, ornate vial of dark liquid. With a terrifyingly calm hand, she uncorked it and poured a single, viscous drop into her own tea. "Honesty is a luxury for the common people," Madame Choi whispered. "For a family like ours, there is only necessity. This tea," she gestured to the cup, "is now poisoned. Not with a toxin that kills the body, but with a truth that kills the soul." She slid the cup across the table toward Efua. "Drink. Taste the bitterness of a life lived in hiding." Efua didn't move. The tension in the room was a physical weight, a pressure that felt like it was trying to crush her lungs. "My son thinks he is a man of two worlds," Madame Choi continued, her eyes narrowing into obsidian slits. "He thinks he can keep the dragon in a suit and the husband in a secret room. But a dragon eventually grows too large for its cave. Do-yoon has a duty to the blood that gave him life. He has a duty to a legacy that was built on the bones of men who tried to choose happiness over power. She leaned forward, the scent of expensive incense and old paper clinging to her. You are the weed in the garden, Efua. You are the flaw in the diamond. As long as you exist, he is weak. And a weak Choi is a dead Choi. I am his wife, Efua countered, her voice rising in defiance. We are bound by a vow you cannot break with threats or vials of shadow. He chose me. He chose a dream, Madame Choi snapped, her composure finally cracking to reveal the steel beneath. And dreams are what we wake up from when the morning comes. The board members are already asking about his absences. The rival clans are sniffing for blood. If you truly love him, you will realize that your presence here is a death sentence. Not for you, but for him. Madame Choi stood up, the movement as fluid as water. She left the tea untouched, the dark drop of liquid swirling in the ginger infusion like a black eye. The dinner is set for next week. He will be asked to choose. I have already chosen for him. If you are still in this city when the sun rises after that dinner, I will not send guards. I will simply let the syndicate know that their king has been replaced by a stranger. I will burn the Choi name to the ground before I let it be diluted. As she walked toward the door, she paused, her profile sharp against the window's gray light. He will reach for the gun, Efua. He always does. I just want you to know whose heart the bullet will hit first. The door clicked shut, leaving Efua alone in the deepening shadows of the penthouse. The ginger tea had gone cold, the poison now settled at the bottom of the cup. Efua looked out at the frozen city, the Seoul tower glowing like a distant, unreachable star. She felt the weight of the matriarch's warning pressing against her chest, a suffocating realization that the secret bride could no longer hide. The war had arrived at her doorstep, and the only weapon she had was a love that the Ice King's mother didn't believe existed. The air in the council room of the Choi estate was thick with the scent of old cedar and the unspoken weight of centuries. It was a space where the modern world of skyscrapers and digital ledgers ceased to exist, replaced by a brutal, ancestral gravity. Choi Do-yoon stood at the center of the room, his black suit looking like a shadow cast against the pale wood of the traditional architecture. Surrounding him were the 7 elders of the syndicate, men whose faces were carved from the same granite as the mountains of Gangwon-do, their eyes clouded with age but sharp with a predatory cunning. They had been watching him. Do-yoon felt it in the way the room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in like the jaws of a trap. For months, he had been the Ice King, but today, the council looked at him as if he were a flaw in a diamond. The rumors had finally reached the inner sanctum, whispers of a hidden woman, of unauthorized flights to West Africa, and a heart that was no longer beating in rhythm with the syndicate's demands. The dragon is only as strong as the cave he protects, the eldest member, Elder Moon, began. His voice was a dry rattle, like dead leaves skittering across stone. We have seen the reports, Do-yoon. The shipping routes in Ghana are secure, yet your mind remains there. A leader who looks backward is a leader who will eventually be struck from behind. Do-yoon remained motionless, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression a masterpiece of stoic indifference. My personal affairs do not interfere with the profit margins, Elder. The Golden Dragon has never been more prosperous. Prosperity is a season, blood is eternal, another elder countered, slamming a gnarled hand onto the low table. The rival Park clan has made an offer. Their daughter, a woman of pure lineage and immense corporate backing, is the mate the Choi family requires. A union between our houses would solidify the underworld for the next 50 years. We demand a pure heir, Do-yoon. A child who carries only the fire of this land. The word pure hung in the air like a poisonous mist. It was a direct strike at Efua, a rejection of everything Do-yoon had found in the warmth of Accra. He felt a surge of cold fury, a desire to burn the room to the ground, but he knew that any display of emotion would be seen as a confirmation of his weakness. He was being asked to facilitate a genocide of his own happiness to satisfy the ghosts of men who had been dead for generations. Before he could respond, the sliding paper doors at the head of the room hissed open. Madame Choi entered, her presence instantly silencing the room. She wore a hanbok of deep, midnight blue, the color of a sea that had never seen the sun. She did not look at her son. She walked straight to the center of the council and took her seat among the men, a matriarch who held more power than any of them. "My son understands his duty," she said, her voice a calm, lethal melody. "He understands that a king does not choose his queen based on the fluttering of his heart, but on the strength of his fortress." She finally turned her gaze toward Do-yoon, her eyes obsidian and unreadable. "The elders are right. The distraction has gone on long enough. The board is restless, and the streets are whispering of a king who has gone soft for a stranger." She reached into the folds of her silk sleeve and produced a small, silver-embossed card. She placed it on the table between them. "Next Friday. The Lunar New Year. We will host the Supper of the Dragon. The Park family will be here. The contract for the marriage will be on the table. And if I refuse?" Do-yoon asked, the question sounding like the cocking of a hammer. Madame Choi didn't flinch. "If you refuse, you are no longer a Choi. You will be stripped of the name, the assets, and the protection of the dragon. And the woman you are hiding in Hanam-dong? She will become a liability that the syndicate will be forced to resolve. A king cannot lead if his hands are tied by a thread of foreign silk." The ultimatum was final. There was no room left for shadow dancing or double lives. The gathering storm had finally broken over his head, and the rain was made of iron. The elders nodded in silent agreement, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the floorboards. Do-yoon walked out of the council room, the cold air of the courtyard hitting him like a physical blow. He looked up at the gray, oppressive sky of Seoul, realizing that the choice was no longer a distant threat. It was a countdown. He had 7 days to either betray the woman who had given him a soul or watch the empire he had built destroy her. As he climbed into his sedan, his hand went instinctively to the hidden pocket of his coat, where a small piece of Kente cloth remained, a fragment of gold in a world that was rapidly turning to ash. The final dinner was set, and for the first time in his life, the Ice King felt the cold. The Lunar New Year dinner was not a celebration, it was a wake for a man who was still breathing. The air in the great hall of the Choi estate was thick with the scent of pine incense and the sterile, metallic tang of the winter air that leaked through the heavy cedar doors. Outside, a blizzard had turned Seoul into a white void, erasing the city and leaving only this house of shadows. At the center of the long, polished table sat Choi Do-yoon, his black suit tailored so sharply it seemed to hold his fragmenting soul together. To his left sat Madame Choi, a vision of ivory-skinned authority in her pale hanbok. To his right, Efua stood at the edge of the light, her emerald and gold Kente shawl a defiant, living flame in a room that worshipped the dead. The table was set with 2 objects that had not been part of the traditional feast, a white manila envelope containing the divorce decree and a matte black 9mm handgun. Between them sat the syndicate's ancestral ledger, a thick, leather-bound volume that contained the names, the debts, and the dark architecture of the Choi Empire. It was the physical heart of their power, a book that had been written in the blood of 3 generations. "The time for poetry has ended, Do-yoon," Madame Choi said, her voice a low, melodic chime that carried the weight of a guillotine. The elders sat in the shadows behind her, their eyes reflecting the candlelight like hunting cats. "The Park family is in the drawing room. They are waiting for a signature to seal the future. Your wife is waiting for a sign to see if she has a husband or a memory. Choose." Do-yoon looked at the gun. He looked at the papers. For a moment, the Ice King mask was perfect, his expression an impenetrable shield of granite. Then, he looked at Efua. She didn't look at the weapons of his world, she looked at him with the same steady, sun-drenched gaze that had thawed his heart in the dust of the Makola market. She was his peace, and he realized with a sudden, violent clarity that he would rather die as a man in her arms than live as a god in his mother's cage. You told me once, mother, that a leader is defined by what he is willing to discard, Do-yoon said, his voice a low baritone that vibrated with a new, dangerous resonance. He didn't reach for the pen. He didn't reach for the gun. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a simple Zippo lighter, the silver casing engraved with a Ghanaian Adinkra symbol Efua had given him. With a flick of his thumb, a small, orange flame danced in the dim light. Madame Choi's eyes widened, a rare crack appearing in her porcelain composure. Do-yoon, what are you doing? I am securing the bloodline, he replied. He leaned forward and touched the flame to the corner of the leather-bound ledger. The paper, dry with age and heavy with secrets, caught instantly. A collective gasp erupted from the shadows as the elders surged forward, but Do-yoon's security detail, men he had spent the last week quietly paying off with his personal, liquidated assets, stepped into the light, their hands on their holsters. They weren't Choi guards anymore, they were his. The ledger flared, the blue and orange flames licking the air, turning the Choi Syndicate into ash and smoke. The names of the debtors, the maps of the smuggling routes, the signatures of corrupt officials, it all dissolved into a charred, blackened mass on the mahogany table. You are burning your life. Madame Choi screamed, standing so abruptly her chair toppled over. That book is the empire. Without it, we are nothing. Without it, I am free, Do-yoon countered, standing up as the fire cast long, distorted shadows across the room. He didn't look at the fire, he looked at his mother, seeing her for the first time not as a goddess of tradition, but as a lonely woman clinging to a ghost. The money is gone, mother. I spent the last 7 days transferring the offshore accounts to a maritime foundation in Accra. The Choi Tower is a shell. The golden dragon is dead. I have killed it so that I might finally live. He turned away from the burning table, the heat of the fire at his back. He walked to Efua and took her hand. Her fingers were warm, real, and steady, the only geography that mattered now. Do-yoon. Madame Choi's voice was a ragged, desperate cry. If you walk out that door, you have no name. You are nobody. Do-yoon paused at the threshold of the great hall, the cold wind from the open doors whipping his hair across his face. He looked back one last time, the fire reflecting in his dark eyes. I have spent 40 years being a Choi, he said softly. I think I'd like to try being a husband. He didn't wait for her response. He didn't wait for the elders to recover. He led Efua out into the blizzard, the snow biting at their skin as they walked toward the car that would take them to the airport. Behind them, the ancestral home was filled with the smell of burning paper and the silence of a broken dynasty. The dragon had scorched his own nest, and as they drove through the whiteout of the Seoul night, Choi Do-yoon finally felt the warmth of the sun. The air in Accra did not taste of iron or cold marble, it tasted of salt, roasted plantains, and a freedom so vast it felt like a physical weight had been lifted from Choi Do-yoon's lungs. 1 year had passed since the night the Ice King had turned his empire to ash in a Seoul blizzard, and the man who stepped onto the balcony of a modest, sun-bleached house in Jamestown bore little resemblance to the ghost who had once haunted the Choi Tower. His tailored black suits were gone, replaced by a simple linen shirt and a pair of trousers that had seen the red dust of the Ghanaian roads. His hair was no longer slicked back with corporate precision, but ruffled by the Atlantic breeze. In the courtyard below, the sounds of life were a rhythmic, beautiful chaos. There were no hushed whispers of terrified underlings or the clicking of safeties on 9mm handguns. Instead, there was the melodic shouting of market women and the bright, high-pitched laughter of children at the community school Efua had helped him build. Do-yoon looked down at his hands. They were no longer clean in the sterile, clinical way of a man who orders others to do his dirty work. They were calloused from hauling supplies and stained with the ink of a maritime consultancy that helped local fishermen navigate the very shipping routes he had once used for smuggling. He had lost $1 billion throne, but for the first time in 40 years, he owned himself. Efua stepped out onto the balcony, her presence a warm light that made the tropical morning feel complete. She was wrapped in the same emerald and gold Kente shawl she had worn on that final night in Seoul, but here, in the glare of the African sun, it didn't look like a defiance, it looked like a part of the landscape. She leaned against the railing beside him, her hand finding his. There was no tremor in his touch now, no hidden tension of a man waiting for a betrayal. "You're staring at the ocean again," she said softly, a playful smile dancing on her lips. "Are you looking for ghosts, or are you just watching the tide?" Do-yoon turned to her, and the light in his eyes was something Madame Choi wouldn't have recognized. It was the look of a man who had finally come home. "The ghosts can't swim this far, Efua. I'm just realizing that the ocean doesn't look like a barrier anymore. It looks like a bridge." He thought back to the Sankofa bird his mother had dismissed as a distraction, the bird that looks back to fetch what was forgotten. He had gone back to fetch his soul, and the price had been everything he once thought defined him. He had no name in the boardrooms of Seoul. He had no seat at the table of the syndicate elders. To the world he left behind, he was a dead man. But as he watched a young boy in the courtyard successfully spell a word for the first time, Do-yoon knew he had never been more alive. "My mother called me at nobody the night we left," Do-yoon whispered, his thumb tracing the gold wedding band on Efua's finger. "She said without the name, I would be nothing." Efua turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the vast, shimmering blue of the Gulf of Guinea. She reached up, her fingers grazing the line of his jaw. "She was wrong, Do-yoon. She taught you that power was a cage you built around yourself. But look at you now." She gestured to the vibrant, noisy, beautiful life they had built together. "You aren't a boss. You aren't a king. You are just a man who is loved. And in this world, that is the only legacy that doesn't burn." The blood and Kente vow they had made under the Aburi mist was no longer a secret kept in the dark, it was the foundation of his every breath. He had traded an empire for a soul, and as the sun rose higher, painting the red dust of Accra in shades of liquid gold, Choi Do-yoon realized that he hadn't just made a choice. He had made a transformation. He closed his eyes, listening to the song of the sea and the laughter of the children, and for the first time in his life, the Ice King was warm. The dragon was gone, and in his place was a man who had finally found the courage to be happy.